and valuation of high growth companies. He started his own company in 1999. His first client was Novartis Venture. Today, the company is active in Singapore, in Switzerland, of course, in Singapore, India, in Ireland, in US, in Canada, and they work with a JV partner in China. They also have partners in Latin America. And this is a subject which interests me a lot, which is something that Patrick is really good at explaining, which is how do you actually evaluate a company's worth, right? And how do you get somebody who's from outside the company to come in and have a look at your company? So Patrick, with that, over to you. We will, by the way, before Patrick just begin, we will have a Q&A session afterwards. But if you have any Q&As, any questions, just put them please in the chat box and I will be monitoring. Over to you, Patrick.
All right. Thanks, Salman, for this introduction, and thanks for having me, and welcome everybody for to this valuation session. By the way, also I think we will put up the slides. We will upload them as well, so you can be viewed and downloaded. Yeah. So it's a great pleasure for me to do this workshop or this session about valuation. What is the company really worth, and how has COVID affected? I can't give you the magic answer to that, but I'll try to see, give you some insight how we value companies and what we do, and hopefully that gives some, a bit of a different perspective. So before we start, just a little bit the background on the company, as Salman mentioned. I'm based in Switzerland, in Zurich, and we have offices in different parts of the world. We are about 36 people in the company, and what we do is actually we do three different things. So one is the valuation. So the name of the company already gives it away, right? So we do independent valuation of mainly life science companies, so biotech and pharma and some medical devices as well. So company valuation, but also product valuation, asset valuation. And this is mainly for licensing deal, in and out licensing. So that's also a big part. So this is the first part, the valuation part. Then we have a Biotech Gate, which is a global life science database, a business development database. And we built this database because we needed to have data. You will see later when we do valuation, it's all about data, it's about assumptions, and to be able to do that, you need to have a lot of information, and so part of that we couldn't find. So we started our own database called Biotech 8 and started collecting information on licensing deal terms, on financing and financing rounds, on clinical trials, on different assets, on what companies doing what. So that's kind of it became a second business area. And then the third thing, what we do is we have a partnering software. So we have a software that arranges these one-to-one meetings. And because now we are in COVID and people are in lockdown and people are in quarantine, we also can do that virtually. And we started doing our own conference with this software. It's called Biotech Gate Digital Partnering. So this is kind of a bit what we do and who we are. So I've been doing valuations for the last 22 years. We have done valuations really globally from Australia, Asia, North America, and Europe. So it's probably about 800 valuations that we have done so far. And typically our clients are on one side investors like Novartis Venture Fund, but also corporate investors, other corporate investors, VCs, family offices, and then also a lot of companies who are trying to raise money and need to know what's the value of their company. So we try to work for both sides, and I always tell people we are Swiss, we are neutral and independent. So that actually works quite well. Good, so that's just to give you a little bit of a background why I'm doing this presentation and background on what we do. this is just this partnering event that we do. I told Salman also, I'm happy to give all the participants today a free ticket to our conference. And you see here the link and the code, and it will be in the presentation, so you can just download it and use that. And with that, you have a free, you can participate for free and see if that's something that's helpful to you, if you're interested. Good. So what would I like to cover today? Just talk very briefly about some financing trends, what we have seen in the past, couple of years, how things have developed, and then talk about company valuation, how we do valuation, what are the key aspects of it. Now, just before we go to the valuation, looking at some investments. So, as I mentioned, we have Biotech Gate. We track the number of investments and the amounts and who is investing and where is do people invest. And so here, just a very simple view. On one side, the amount that is being invested in biotech companies, and on the other side, the Nasdaq Biotech Index. And you can see, obviously, the Nasdaq Biotech Index, how that has gone up in the last 10 years. It has really increased dramatically, and you can see also the last 1 or 2 years, even there we had an increase. And in parallel to that, the amount amounts being raised by biotechs also has gone up. So there's a lot of money available to the biotech companies. So I think for any biotech startup, this is good news. But at the end of the day, companies still have to hunt for investors, and they have to convince investors. So at the end, there's always more projects than there's money around. But there's definitely a lot of money in the market. A lot is being invested. That's definitely what we see. And also, judging from the level of what we do or how busy we are, there's a lot of activity. So, talking about valuation. So one of the things when I talk to people about valuation, there's a difference between value and price, and I think that's important to acknowledge. When you talk about value, that is more an inherited worth or something. The price, on the other side, it's supply and demand. Right? It's at the end, it comes back to what is somebody willing to pay, and this is sometimes when I talk to companies and they say, well, should I do a valuation, or I just go to the investor and he tells me what he thinks I'm worth. Well, he will tell you what he thinks he will offer, what the price he offers, right? He doesn't necessarily tell you what he thinks you're worth. What we do is we try to come up with a fair value of a company or a fair value of an asset. But this is not setting the price. The price is really then at the end is supply and demand. And Warren Buffett put that very nicely. Price is what you pay and value is what you get. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And it's like when you buy a house, right? You might get an appraisal of that house, but at the end, if you really want to buy it, you might offer a higher price than what the valuation is. And that's the same thing here. We try to do a valuation, we come up with a value range, but the price, might be higher, might be lower. Right? So evaluation is a basis for these price negotiations. And, looking at the valuations and looking at the prices that are being paid, COVID, that was one of the questions. How has COVID affected, also infected, but how has COVID affected the prices? Well, you can argue that the valuation has stayed the same, but there is more demand, people wanting to invest in life science companies. So the prices have definitely gone up. I mean, that's definitely something we see. So why do we do valuation, and why is valuation important? And here we have a classical example. We have a company, you have an investment of €500,000. And for the investor, the question is, how much equity do I get for my investment? So you can now start and say, well, we do the valuation. Typically, we would try to come up with this pre-money value. And if we value the company, or the company is valued at 1.5 million, you invest $500,000, the investor gets 25%. So pre-money is before the investment, and you have a post-money value of 2 million, so after the investment. So this is the classical question that we try to answer when we work with companies. Now, and Salman asked me to maybe do some examples, and this is a classical example. This year a company that we've valued. It's a European biotech company. They're preclinical, and they were looking to raise 25 euros to bring their product, to IND, and then the first part of the clinic. And in this case, actually, the investor asked them about an independent valuation. So as I mentioned, our clients sometimes are the companies and sometimes the investors. So in this case, the investor who has already agreed with the company on the terms, but they needed to have a valuation, an independent valuation, to justify the investment and the amount that they're paying for the company. So we did a valuation project. So we did an independent valuation of the company. We had numerous discussion with the key management, so with the CEO, CFO, with the CSO. We discussed, the different assumptions. So in terms of, how long will it take to bring the product to IND? How long will the clinic take? How many patients will they need? What would be the cost for the clinical development? And one of the things was here that the company said, well, we're going to out-license the product after phase 2. So we haven't really thought about, especially phase 3 and later, the market. However, for us doing evaluation, we have to take that into account as well. So we do the valuation, and we'll see that a bit later. So we look at the full development. No matter if the company out-licensed that early or late, we look at the full development timelines and cost. We look also at the market, at the target indications. So we had that discussion with the company, and at the end, the investor got about 45% for their investment. So there was a pre-money value of about 33 million for the company. And what we had to confirm is that what the investor pays was definitely worth his investment. So our valuation report basically confirmed that the pre-money value was more than 33 million. So that was kind of the output, or our valuation report confirmed that. So in general, doing valuations of life science companies or biotech companies particularly is people say it's an art, or it's even a black art, and doing that. It's not an exact science, right? It's not one formula fits all, everybody gets to the same valuation. It doesn't happen. You can ask 10 different valuation experts, you get 11 different answers. And there's different reasons. One is, the traditional valuation methods, they don't really work. You can't do a price earning valuation of such a company. Well, there's no earnings, there's no profit, right? These companies typically don't make any revenues. They're basically sold before they have any revenues. Asset valuation, well, the asset are intangible assets. It's know-how, it's IP, but you don't have, tangible assets that are in the books. So traditional methods don't really work. So we have to look at alternative ways. On the other side, valuation is very important. Most of the companies we value, they do several rounds of financing. So, you want to be able to increase the value over time. So you don't want to go too high at the beginning, because, that's difficult then to increase the value of the company. But you also don't want to start too low, because otherwise, as a founder, you get diluted. And by the time you reach some critical milestones, you don't own anything of the company anymore. But valuation is really, it's key for these companies. Also, when they out-license products, right? What kind of deal terms can you get? Again, it comes back to, what is the value of these assets? What kind of deal terms can you get? Now we have very complex technologies, new technologies. We have IP situations, which it doesn't make it easy to value these companies, and we have high uncertainties, right? I mean, there's on one side a lot of potential. If you get that next cancer drug to the market, I mean, this is a huge potential. But you also have very high risks that maybe 1 in 10 will make it from clinical development, or even less. And the investment cycles are very long. So these are all reasons why probably valuing biotech is probably one of the most difficult things to do. Now, talking about valuation, what's probably also helpful is to think about what is the mindset of investors? So venture capital investors, business angels, family offices, anybody putting money into biotech, right? Now, on one side, the investors typically, obviously, they would like to have low risk and high return, right? That would be ideal. But in general, investors are willing to take a risk, but they want to be compensated for that. They expect a high return, right? They have their own pressure from investors, especially VC funds. They have to go raise money as well, and they compete in the capital market. So if you look at the different risk-return ratios, I have here listed some examples. If you invest in a 10-year government bond in Switzerland, or in Germany or the US, the probability that you don't get your money back is extremely low, right? But your return, your interest rates that you get is also very low. In Switzerland, it's negative. You give money to the government for 10 years, and in 10 years you get less money back, but you will get it back. I mean, that's pretty sure. Now, the higher risk you take, the more of a return you're looking for. If you invest in bonds or you buy shares of a blue chip company, probability is still, that the company won't be around anymore is relatively low. But there's a certain risk, and you want to be compensated for that. Now, if you invest in a biotech company, you take a big risk. Typically there's lots of risks involved. There's no product on the market yet. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of risk. So taking that risk, you want to be compensated for that. So your return requirements are higher, right? So at the end of the day, when we talk about valuation, it's all about risk and return, right? So these are the two main factors that drive the value of these companies. It's the risk on one side and the potential return. So the question is, how do we assess the risk now of a company? And that's one of the key questions. At the end, when we do evaluation, we do a workshop with the company. So we really try to understand the management, we try to understand the market and the technology behind the company. So we try to understand the risk profile. What are the key risks involved? So understanding the fundamentals and understanding what are the value drivers of the company is essential when we do valuation. And I always tell people, you can do all the Excel calculation you want, but that's the easiest part, right? And people sometimes get lost in these huge Excels and you can do all the calculations, but at the end it comes back to the assumptions that you take. And that's where you should spend the time. When we do valuation, we try to really understand the background of the company to make educated decisions and assumptions. That's the key. And the calculation, that's really the smallest part. So again, we did evaluation last year that there was a US-based biotech company. It's a phase 2. Their lead product was in phase 2 in oncology. They had some different products or different indications, a combo therapy, but also monotherapy. They already had an existing licensing deal, and where they received already upfront, but also future milestone and royalty payments. And they were looking to raise 40 million. And so our job, or the question for them was, how much equity do we have to give away to investors who invest 40 million? So what we did, unfortunately at the moment, we can't really travel. We used to go and really visit the company and had a face-to-face meeting. We had typically we spent 1 to 3 days with the management team. So what we did now in this case, we had about 5 video calls with the management team, with different people in the team. We had different discussions and different topics that we covered. And we looked at the scientific rationale. So we really tried to understand the background of the science. And we have in our team, when we do valuation, we have people with scientific background that comes from big pharma, and we have people more from the business and financial side. So it's a combination of understanding the business and understanding the science side. So we looked at the scientific rationale, we looked at the IP, and here already we could see there were some issues that we saw, or the length of the patent, how long they would have patent protection, and there was some orphan indication that that can extend the protection. So we took that into account. We looked at the pipeline of the company, what kind of other products they have, what stage are they in. We looked at the partnership, so they worked with with the university where they could access some future projects. They had this licensing deal with a partner in Asia. We did a competitive analysis for the company to see who else is active in these indications. How crowded is the space? What kind of pricing could the company expect for its product? We looked at the market size and the positioning. So we really tried to go and understand and do an assessment of the company and the products to see also where are the key risks involved. And then what we have to do is then translate that into a rate, into the discount rate that we used in the valuation. But for us, this assessment is always a very big part, understanding the background of the company. So translating then the assessment is really to see what are the key risks and translating that into a discount rate. That is kind of the level of how big is the risk involved. And here I could do a whole other workshop on that. But at the end, this is kind of how we translate the soft factors into numbers. You can do it with RNPV, risk-adjusted net present value, or discounted cash flow, and I come back to that. But here, this is kind of where we translate the soft factors into numbers. In terms of valuation approaches and tools, so there are also a number of different ways of doing valuation. And there's no clear one way or the other. There's more operational-based methods. You look at the business plan and you look at how much money a company needs and what kind of return can it generate. You can look more at market-based methods. You look at comparable companies. You look at prices and trends that are being paid. So there's a whole range of different methods. DCF, RNPV, venture capital, and market comparable transactions. What we try to do when we do a valuation of a company, we always try to use a combination of different methods, because each method has advantages and disadvantages. And there's no right method, but at the end it's a combination, and that also gives us at the end a value range. So typically our result for valuation is a range where we say, the value of that company is between 20 and 24 million. And it comes also from these different perspectives and the different methodologies. So the discounted cash flow, what we try to do here is trying to look into the future and see what kind of revenues, what kind of profits can a company generate. And then we try to see what is the present value of that. So this is kind of a fundamental approach to valuation. And we use that similar approach, discounted cash flow, when we do therapeutic product valuation. Here, the methodology is called RNPV, risk-adjusted net present value. And basically, it's the same thing as with the discounted cash flow. So you try to see what kind of profits and what kind of free cash flows can the company generate in the future. And you can see here, maybe there's 4 or 5 years of development of, the cost for clinical development. And then the product gets to the market and you get to some peak sales. And then at some point there's a patent expiry, and you would expect there's generics or biosimilars coming to the market, and your profitability, your profits will go down. Now the method would try to see what is the present value of these future profits, but also risk adjust them. So we try to see what is actually the probability that we get a product to the market, right? And in biotech and pharma, having these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, we have very clear development paths. So there's a lot of historical information about these probabilities for different indications, for different phases of development. So we can use that for valuation. And without going into too much details, but you may have seen these probabilities of getting a product to the market. And you can see here for different indications, there are different probabilities, historical probability. And these are, this is a study that Bio did from 2011 to 2020. So they looked at thousands of clinical trials and to see what is the probability that a product gets actually approved. So the likelihood of approval, you can see here for metabolic, it's 15%, hematology, it's even 24%. And if you go down oncology or cardiovascular, or urology, we are at 5 or 4% probability. So basically from phase 1 getting to the market. So this data, this information we would use for the valuation. Because we have a probability that a product will make it phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and then all the way to the market. Now, what can we do with that? And now, I think this is always the most interesting thing. What we can do with this information is that we can calculate the value of an asset. We can calculate the value today. So at the start here, for example, at phase 1, here, this example would give us a value of 8 million for this asset, right? Now, every time a clinical phase is passed successfully, then the value will jump up because we eliminate that risk, and our probability of success now is higher, right? So the closer you get. So after phase 1, our value will go to 18 million. After phase 2, our value will jump to 125 million. Then 477. So I can already predict today what is the value today, but what is the value when we hit certain milestones in the future? And this is very interesting, obviously, for investors. When I see, okay, for a phase 1, I have to invest now, 2 million. So I know, what is the value today, but what could it be afterwards? But it can also help me to look at different deal terms, right? If I get a payment after phase 3, or if I get a payment, a milestone payment after phase 1, there's a difference, right? There's different risks involved. And I can calculate the value of these milestones. And, this is typically when you look at the publicly listed company, especially one product companies, when they report a failure or a successful clinical trial, you see exactly this: the value of the shares will go up or it will go down if a negative trial has been reported. And even for big companies, for a Roche or for a Pfizer, if you have a phase 3 product that a lot of hope was put in and there's a failure, it has an impact on the share price. And that's exactly this effect you see here. Now, in terms of, there's other valuation methods. I'm not going into very much detail here. Other methods. One method that I wanted to mention, and I think is also very interesting, it's called the venture capital method. Venture capitalists typically, before they invest, they already want to know how they exit, right? And that's the name of the game for them, right? They have a fund, they need to invest, but they will have to exit, they have to sell the shares as well. So typically, investors will already look at what kind of exit price could they get for a company, what kind of exit value, right? So they try to look into the future and see, a phase 2 product in oncology, I might be able to sell this company for, 100 billion. So in 3 years or in 5 years, when I can reach that milestone, the value of the company could be 100 billion. So what you can do then is calculate back and see what would the investor pay today. Now, if he can get 100 billion for the company in 3 years, he's not going to pay 100 billion today, right? Because he wouldn't make any return on his investment. So you can then try to see what kind of return would the investor ask for, and you can calculate what would be a value today that gives the investors a certain return over this time period. And I think this is also a very interesting approach, and helps also companies to put things in perspective. If a company thinks they should be worth 500 billion today, well, you can make this calculation. What value do you have to have in 3 years to make a return for investors, right? So you will have to have quite a bit more than 500 billion. So this, I think, again, is a good exercise also for the companies to see what is a realistic assumption and where do they have to go to justify a valuation that they think have today. So this is also an approach we use when we do valuation, just to see what kind of exit value, what kind of future values can the company generate, and then calculate back. Good. So just to keep also a bit on time, I think, as I mentioned, as a conclusion, valuation is really, it's very important. It's difficult. And, I always tell people, we have a crystal ball when we do valuation. You have to look into the future, and nobody knows what's going to happen. But it's important for any biotech to understand what is the value today, what is the value tomorrow, how can they increase the value of the company or of the asset? Because most of the biotech companies will have to raise money again and again and again. Right? That's the name of the business, of the game. So it's important, valuation. Then valuation is all about assumptions. Right? I mean, I tell people I can make any valuation you want. Right? And it's all about the assumptions you take. So the assumptions have to be reasonable, and we try to benchmark assumptions we take for the amount of time it will take for a product to reach the market, for the number of patients that are used for the clinical trial, for the pricing of the product when it gets to the market, for the peak sales that the product will achieve, right? So we try to justify why we come to certain assumptions. And we had a company and they thought they can have peak sales of $40 billion. And I just said, look, there's no product out there that makes $40 billion. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's important that you benchmark and you look at these, what are reasonable assumptions. You can be optimistic, and every company should be, but it has to be reasonable. So it's all about assumptions. And at the end, the value of any product and company, it doesn't matter what you have done in the past, how much money has been spent. What matters is, what are you going to do in the future with that? So what's the potential of your asset, your product, your technology, and what's the risk achieving that potential? So valuation is really driven by this future potential and the risk. Now, one of the magic questions, what can we do to increase the value of our company, of our product? And the easy answer is always, well, you can try to increase the potential, right? You can find additional markets, you can find other indications. That's one of the things people think most of to increase the value. What most people forget is if you decrease the risk, you also increase the value, right? And I think that's also something to keep in mind. If you can de-risk your projects, if you can de-risk, aspects in the company, then you can increase the value. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, the valuation, at the end, it's price versus value, right? A valuation is a basis to negotiate the price with the buyer and the seller. And valuation is one of the aspects, but it's not everything. So, you can do all the valuation you want, but you have to find the investor who is willing to invest, right? And you have to find the right investor. Maybe it's not just their money, but there might be other aspects as well. So it's at the end, it comes back to price versus value. Good. And with that, I'd like to close, and I think we can do some Q&A if there are any.
Yes, there'll be quite a few, Patrick. So, Patrick, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure there'll be many. There are a few questions in the chat box. There'll be others also coming up. We are very fortunate, by the way, to have some real heavyweights in the group today. We have Professor Alex Martyr, who has spent a lifetime of not just discovering new drugs, but is also right now working on a new company. I think it's in oncology. We have our old friend Tim Oldham. I don't know if you can hear us. Tim is also a seasoned campaigner, going from big pharma to mid-sized pharma, and I think you are now developing a new company. And then we have Doris Alpiser, who has been not in biotech, but she is a real entrepreneur. She's been growing companies, starting companies, growing companies, a little bit like Gert Hoogland also. So I think we have a very nice mix of people. So there'll be quite a few Q&As coming up. There is in the chat box, if I may just start with a question which has been posed by Jörg Hermann. Jörg, if you could unmute yourself, please, and ask the question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Excellent talk. I appreciate it. One of the questions that I had was the difference between, an early stage, not in the clinics or preclinical company versus maybe a company that has an asset in phase 1 or 2, in terms of where does the company put the emphasis on evaluations? I mean, there's some basics probably in place, and perhaps basics that do not change, but perhaps the way it's being looked at. Do you differentiate by focusing more on the science, for instance, in the preclinical stage, and more on the financial, on the revenue aspects in the, when they're in a phase 2 stage? Because, you have less risk, more certainty in phase 2, so the revenues matter a little bit more, or perhaps are a little bit more reliable. But in, preclinical, revenues, from my understanding or from my experience, are less relevant. So I'd like to get the expert opinion on that, and that would certainly be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, very good question. Obviously, for preclinical assets and companies, as you said, you have less information, you have less certainty, also in which direction it goes. When we do sometimes valuation of preclinical assets, the company doesn't know yet exactly what the indication is, right? So what we have to do, sometimes these projects are even looking at what would be a suitable indication to go after. And we have to take certain assumptions here. And you're right, the closer you get to the market, the more time you spend looking at, the different aspects in terms of the finance and in terms of, market potential and differentiation from, the competitive landscape. And earlier stage companies and assets, we look more at the science. That is a more important aspect. We also look, if it's a platform company, we also try to see what can the company generate out of that platform. There might be an asset, but there might be other assets as well, and we try to put a value on a platform as well. But the earlier it is, the more difficult it is, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and would you then, to hedge for that early stage risk, would you say that, well, look, you can figure this out in terms of the terms of the deal, because there's an element there where you can hedge those things, given the unknowns, the many unknowns, and the range of potential that this company may have?
I mean, the deal is one, it depends on the strategy of the company when they want to out-license and you do a valuation of an asset or of the whole company. But the deal terms is certainly one way of looking at hedging the risk and who is taking how much risk at the end of the day, right? If you have a front-loaded deal, the company takes less risk and gets the money up front, but then also has less upside in the long term, right? Yeah. In case it's successful. But that's at the end of the day, depends on the preference.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jörg. Tim, you're sitting down under. I think you're far, far away from us, somewhere in Australia, in deep, dark Australia. And you have been, as I said before, a seasoned campaigner. Do you want to share with us some of the challenges that you're facing with respect to valuation of your new baby, or not so new anymore, huh?
Yeah, thanks, Salman. It's great to be here, and thanks, Patrick, for your presentation. I think the piece that interests me at the moment, we're a small microcap listed company, as far too many of us are in Australia at the moment, and our issue is less around valuation and more around price. And our price gets set every day by what happens in the public markets. And so what I'm really interested in is what happens when there's a disconnect between price and value, and what are the factors. And I think this went to one of the other questions that's in the chat, which is really about what are the other intangible factors that drive price as opposed to value, like the reputation of your board, your management team, the therapeutic area you happen to be in at any given point in time, how well you actually spruik and PR the company and market the company, seem to be as bigger drivers, if not bigger drivers, for small companies than the underlying value that you've done a great job of describing, Patrick.
So that's a question, Sinfana, if we can also take your question into this question too. So intangibles, what role do intangibles play? Very difficult to evaluate.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick, for that wonderful talk, and Tim for kind of leading that really wonderful question. I'm looking for the answer too. I was just, trying to think about how valuation is affected by the team, obviously, because that's something I don't think you touched on, Patrick. And the team is so important, obviously.
If you pay him, he said in so many ways, you pay him enough money, he can tell you anything. But this ties in with what Tim also asked. I think it's a very important question, frankly, which we struggle with in startups. How do you evaluate the intangibles? Is the question from Tim and from Sanfana.
Yeah, and I think that's we always put that this is the assessment framework that we try to use. And look at the management team, at the science and technology, look at the market and the market potential. Now, in terms of the management team, I think this is, and for us, this is really very important, but it's probably one of the most difficult things to value. And what we try to do is, I can run down quickly what we look at is the track record of the people individually, but also as a whole, working together, right? You can have great people individually, they can't work together, it doesn't work. And you want to have people with different backgrounds, they should be complementary. You don't need to have 5 CEOs or 5 CFOs, right? You need to have people with different backgrounds. And we look at the incentive structure. People need to be incentivized properly, right? They want to be participating if the company is successful. We look at the involvement of board, right? You may have a junior, a startup company coming out of university. The people are not so seasoned yet, but maybe in the board, they have people who have been in the business for many years, or they have certain backgrounds in the board that are missing at the moment in the management team. So we have different aspects that we take into account and try to assess and try to rate even when we do evaluation.
Okay.
And now for Tim, in terms of how do you do that for micro caps? And then that's I think also a $1 million question, right? How do you kind of communicate the value of the companies to investors when if the market goes down, everything goes down? I think to a certain degree it's also size, as you mentioned, the micro caps, right? They're often a bit under the radar, and there's probably not enough recognition, or people just don't pay attention. There's no coverage. There is people are not following these companies, and then you're much more dependent on the market sentiment. I mean that's a problem if you have a lot of small companies, right? How to solve that? I haven't found the answer to that yet, right? That would be a millionaire probably if I do. But I think what we have seen is companies trying to merge or to get additional assets to get to a critical size, right? But it's easier said than done. I understand.
Yeah. Okay, Patrick, thank you so much. A couple of quick fire questions. I'm conscious of time. Norbert is asking, any big differences in valuing a device company, diagnostics, which is where Norbert has a lot of experience, and pharma, and I should also add pharma and biotech. Sometimes we tend to forget that pharma is different from biotech. So do you see any big differences in when you're evaluating these companies?
I mean, there are certain differences. I mean, at the end of the day, the overall approaches are similar, right? You want to see, on one side, comparable. You look at exit valuation. You look at what are the fundamental, what kind of profit can the companies generate. For the RMPV, this risk adjustment, the data on these risk adjustment is typically only available where you have clinical trials, right? So if you have devices or where you don't need to have these clinical trials, there's no really data available, also for medical devices. So that makes it a bit more difficult to use that approach.
Okay.
On the other side, typically you are faster to market. Your risk is typically a bit lower, but we still do valuation. We might then just do a discounted cash flow or a market comparable and venture capital.
Okay, so the upside is upside, of course, is less, yeah, probably. Doris, you had a question, comment. Doris Albiza, do you want to ask Patrick your question, please?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. It was really an excellent presentation. I learned a hell of a lot in really clear terms. That was really great. I'm currently involved in an e-health startup, and given your vast experience with investors and funding partners, how would you approach finding a funding partner for such an e-health startup, which is structured as a cooperative, which makes it a hell of a lot more difficult compared to having it as a limited company. So the company already has a fair number of pilots. They have been funded so far through grants and through foundations and through a subordinated loan. But in the long term, we need some proper financing. How will you approach that?
Yeah, that's. I mean, at the end of the day, the question is, what is an investor? Is it a pure financial investor? Can they, at the end, can they generate some return? If that is possible, you might find probably people who are, have something that's closer to the market, maybe with family offices. Mm-hmm. But if it's, if it's at the end, if it's more of a philanthropic investment, right? You would obviously have to go a different route and find sponsors or find philanthropic investors who are open to finance such a venture without expecting a huge return. But that's it probably also depends on the size of investment that they need, right? It's for any company. It's always you have to talk to the right investor. If you're looking for 1, 2, 3 million, you shouldn't go to a venture capitalist. It's just the wrong people. And if you're looking for big amounts, right, then you don't go to a business angel because that typically don't have that deep pockets.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We have Vish, who normally sits in Beijing, but I think Vish, you're still sitting in Chennai. A very obvious question is asking about valuation differences between vaccine companies and pharma companies. Which do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. Hi, Salman. Thanks for this talk. I think it was great. I'm sitting in Chennai. I haven't yet been able to move back to Beijing. Yeah, my question is pretty straightforward. You've already read it out, Salman. So, any differences with the current COVID pandemic going on? Do you see a trend towards vaccines and preventive health?
I mean, in general, there are always certain topics that pop up, right? And then suddenly all the investors think they have to jump on that bandwagon, then prices are typically then higher that are being paid. And so you see this impact, absolutely. Right? I mean, you see higher prices for certain technologies, but this is, I think it's true for different types of not just vaccines. I mean, CAR T, immuno-oncology, you have the different areas where investors are just very interested and pay higher amounts. And a crisis like we have today, obviously that has an impact on prices.
Yep.
And on interest from investors.
Yeah. Alex, I don't know if you're still there. Would you like to ask a question, because you're starting a new venture, very different from what you were doing before? Do you have any question to Patrick?
I would like. Thanks, Patrick, for your talk. Excellent. I'd like to know what are sort of the most frequent reasons for failures.
Sorry, a failure of valuation or just failure in general?
Of small companies.
So Patrick has a vested interest. Patrick, you should actually. Alex has a vested interest in asking that question, Patrick, because he is just starting a new company.
Yeah, great that you could join, Alex. Great to have you here as well. And very good question. I think from what we have seen now in the last 20 years, I think it's the management, what was said before. It's the people who will break or make a company. And, often, we've been doing this valuation for 22 years, and we have gone back and tried to see, the values that we came up with and what was being paid afterwards. And, we were maybe 60, 70%, it was within the range, and 30% it was outside, right? And then we tried to see why did we say it was a higher or lower value than what was being paid afterwards. And one of the things we noticed is sometimes we had lower values of companies, and then an investor came in and he changed some of the management team. So, and transformed the company and made it successful. So at the time when we valued the company, maybe we thought that the management team was not really up to scratch. We gave it a lower valuation. An investor came in and say upgraded the management team, brought in maybe the right people, and then you have a higher value and get higher financing rounds. So, but I think at the end, I would say probably it's more the management team than the science.
Okay, that's interesting. So even for a startup, you think that is the case, right?
Okay.
Yeah, because you have to raise money. People maybe they can't get the money. They start to fight with each other. Until you know that the science doesn't work. That takes a long time. You might know that in the clinic. The best expert often cannot tell you if this product is going to work or not. Right? I mean, certain things are obvious, but a lot of things are not, and that's why you do the clinical trials. But on the way, often it's the management team who just stumbles.
Yeah, so it can make a break. Last question. I'm conscious of time, unless there are other questions. But there is one question which Jade Chen has been waiting patiently for. She's sitting in China, and Patrick, she says, all this is nice, but how much does it cost?
Obviously, there's a certain price, yes. So, I mean, when we do evaluation of a company, it obviously depends how many assets and so on. But typically it's for a full company with a number of assets, it's maybe 35 to 45,000 euros.
Really, not more than that?
Well, I'm glad that I have to now buy you a beer for this comment, but
no, but seriously, because that kind of a service that you're providing, and I know that for a fact that it is of use to not just only companies but also private equity, VCs. We didn't talk about family offices, by the way. I think at some stage they also, when I have a situation right now of a family office that I'm dealing with, sitting in the Middle East, and they don't really understand the principle of valuation. So honestly, when you think of it, 35, 40, anything below 50K seems to be pretty good value for money.
I agree. Obviously, if you're a startup company and you had some friends and families investing $500,000 into company, and you're now doing a Series A and you have to invest that, right, for your Series A, that's a lot of money, right? And you have to always think, do I do more preclinical trials, or do I, but at the end of the day, if you want to raise money, you have to spend money. I mean, going to talk to investors, and it's obviously.
Jade, do you want to sign up for Patrick's services, or do you have any other question? If you can hear us.
Yes.
So you want to sign up for Patrick's services? I don't get a commission, huh?
I actually have a follow-up questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We have some more time. Actually,
Jade, sorry to interrupt you, but where are you in Hong Kong, or are you in China?
No, I'm in Germany, actually.
Okay, yep.
May I have just typing now?
No, go ahead. You can ask. You don't have to.
May I ask a follow-up question for deep tech and high tech? Actually, we have rarely heard about the technical due diligence, because a lot of investors only do the financial due diligence and legal due diligence. But from our working experience, it's not so sufficient. If for some project within the high tech and deep tech area, you having some professionals provide a technical due diligence. May Patrick please share a bit about this insight?
So your question is that from the services that they offer, if I understand correctly, do they also provide technical due diligence? Okay.
So specializing on deep tech and high tech, really how much such a deep tech and high tech worth, or?
I mean, for any valuation we do, right, there are different aspects. So we look at the technology, we look at the IP, we look at the market. So, we do a due diligence in these different areas, but we are not a full, IP specialist, right? We have people with IP background, patent background. The same is true for the technology. We can assess the technology, we can assess the science. But if you have to have a full, full technical expertise, then it might be worth going to like another university professor who is also specialist in this field, right? Who can give you an opinion. The problem often is then it might be a competing professor, or and there's maybe not so many specialists who really understand exactly that specific field, right? Yep. So when we do evaluation, we can go deeper, but we are not going all the way down really to the end, because within evaluation, this is not possible. It takes 4 to 6 weeks for us to do a full company evaluation, right?
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
I mean, just to put things in perspective.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for attending. I'm very cautious of time. In fact, we have overrun the time because it's such an interesting subject. So Patrick, to you especially, thank you so much. We will be sharing Patrick's presentation with all who signed up. In fact, we will have it actually on the LinkedIn site. Next event is going to be on the 21st of October. Very interesting, with Robert Braithwaite, and he will talk about building a successful pharma company in China. a company that I happen to know quite well. Robert exited early this year, started from scratch, and the exit, well, you will hear about it. It was a very nice exit that he did earlier this year. And then on the 10th of November, we have Jens Kruger, who will be talking about value-based pricing, because that was a desire, a wish that came from a number of people. In addition to that, Santvana has got us all excited since yesterday on the whole issue, the whole area of Ayurvedic medicine. And that is something that we will be putting together also. Timing-wise, I don't know when it will be. I hope if we cannot have it before end of this year, I think we should be able to. Then we will have it very early next year. So with that, I would like to thank you in particular, Patrick, and especially a big thank you to Andre Bates, who's sitting in London, who's part of our advisory board, for the generous use, as always, of her Zoom. Yeah. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon.